All right, this lesson is about seeing the big picture of global ecology. Things that we've seen before, like photosynthesis and cell respiration. We saw that at the cellular and maybe organism level, but now we're looking at the global level. How do materials cycle throughout the entire geosphere and around the globe? Let's have a look. First off, by way of definition, when we talk about the geosphere, we're talking about the part of Earth that's solid. So everything that's mountains or ground or rocks, all the way down to the core of the Earth. The atmosphere is any of the air, so that's from sea level on up to the edge of space. Get my pointer here. There we go. Yeah, so sea level up to the edge of space, that's atmosphere, that's the air. And then hydrosphere, maybe not as familiar with that one, that's any water. So the oceans, lakes, any water vapor that's up in the sky, clouds, all of that there counts as hydrosphere. Geosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere. All of those parts of the Earth can actually cycle different materials around. You're familiar with weather patterns. The hydrosphere, water can move things around. Atmosphere, wind blows. Geosphere, volcanoes, other geologic action. There's all these different parts of Earth that are actually moving, some more slowly, some more quickly. But all these interact with the biosphere, anything that's living, or anything, if we're talking about where living things can live. You've got stuff in the oceans, you've got stuff that lives on land, and then some things that can survive airborne, things that fly, or things that are like bacteria that are stuck in the air. Biosphere interacts with all these different layers of Earth: geosphere, atmosphere, and hydrosphere. Let's have a look in this lesson at two large cycles: the hydrologic or water cycle and the carbon cycle. There's a lot of terms on this slide, and I'm going to mention them here in context. I encourage you, as you're working through just filling out your concept outline, go find individual definitions as to make sure you've got each of these, but I'm showing you the big picture. Let's look in context. How can water move around the Earth? Chances are you've seen something about water cycle in a previous science course. We're seeing it here as all the different ways it can move. If you look in the center there, we've got our little farm, and it's next to a river and there's a lake. So you've got here the possibility of some water that can get back into the air through evaporation. Eventually it can make its way up into the atmosphere, and there's a couple ways it can leave. It can do that through condensation, which eventually turns into precipitation. Condensation and precipitation are ways that water leaves the atmosphere, condensing and then falling as rain or snow or sleet or hail. I'm recording this as Hurricane Helen is approaching, so there's a bit of weather headed our way. It was raining pretty hard until a few minutes ago. My power was blinking out. There's even some hail coming down. All right, so that water can get back. It can land in our oceans. It can get into rivers. Perhaps it falls as snow. It lands in an area where it's cold. This comes down and it can freeze. It can be stuck as ice caps for a long time. So chances are you're familiar with those processes. Something that may not be quite as familiar to you is the idea that water can filter down into the ground. We call it infiltration. I think your terms list calls it percolation. Same thing, but it can get into the ground there, and we have our soil water and we have groundwater. Okay, gets down in there. If you've heard about water tables, again, kind of the same idea. This isn't a geology class, but water can be underground. It's there. It can sit for long periods of time, and then we can tap into it with wells. When I was growing up in rural Kansas, we were not on city water. We had a well, so something that went down about 80 feet, and there was a pump to bring that water up to us, and then filter systems, etc., etc. All these different ways that water can move around Earth. Now, because things can move around through the hydrologic cycle, through other geologic cycles, there's one other material we need to think about, especially, and that's carbon. To look into that, how carbon can move around, let's have a look at not only just these processes here with humans and nature, but what were those two main things that put carbon into the atmosphere or pull it out? Remember our cow and grass? Cell respiration and photosynthesis. Let's remind ourselves of those again. These are two big processes that move around materials for biomolecules. We had cell respiration, the process of releasing chemical energy from biomolecules to support life processes. Particularly when we looked at that equation, we looked at sugar. We took glucose and we combined it with oxygen, and CO2 came out, and water. That was the opposite of photosynthesis, where we took CO2 and we took water, used sunlight energy to turn things into sugars, into chemical energy. These two processes are complementary, and they've been going on forever here on Earth. And what we need to think about in terms of the carbon cycle is, what is the human connection to this? What's the human impact? Cell respiration and photosynthesis. Keep those in the back of your mind as we look at the carbon cycle in a second. Question for you before we go to this next slide. What does the most photosynthesis on Earth? Chances are probably plants come to mind. Maybe you're thinking of the largest plants on Earth. Maybe it's the trees. Or maybe you're thinking, well, maybe there's more grass than trees. Maybe it's the grass that does the most photosynthesis. And the answer is nothing on Earth. Actually, on land is doing most of the photosynthesis. That honor belongs to phytoplankton. The image you see here is actually hundreds of miles wide. This is satellite imagery of the oceans. Phytoplankton out in the ocean is doing 70% of all the photosynthesis on good old planet Earth there. All that green you see in the sea in the ocean, that's phytoplankton, little microbes that are doing photosynthesis just out there in the sunny ocean water. Keep that in mind as we think about connections between carbon cycle and hydrologic cycle here in a second. We're going to spend most of our time here. Carbon cycle is pretty big on, on the EOC for biology, and there's a lot that's going on here. Take a moment as you look at this, infographic. What are all the ways that carbon can move around? Two of them I've just mentioned. You see your cell respiration here, photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is going to take carbon out of the air and put it into living things. Sometimes we call this the idea of biomass. We've got all this living plant material, or even dead plant material, like a log, a tree trunk that falls in a forest. All of that material there, all of the carbon, all that's in all the glucose, that's in all the cellulose, that's in all those plants, that carbon all came from the air. I've said it before as I've been teaching this, but plants are made out of air, so to speak. They're made most specifically out of the carbon dioxide that plants pull out during photosynthesis. Or if we're talking about the biomass out in the oceans, photosynthesis being done by phytoplankton, algae, all that stuff out there. Okay, that's biomass. That's carbon capture that's happening. Humans started doing a little thing called the Industrial Revolution. So you think early 1800s, where we start to realize we can burn coal to run steam engines. We started doing fossil fuel mining big time. We took all of this plant matter that's been compressed underground for long amounts of time, and we started to burn it. And for the first time in history, we started to upset the equilibrium. There's things that are putting carbon into the atmosphere, and there's ones that are taking it out. Photosynthesis is the big one that takes carbon out of the atmosphere. But then cell respiration, any animal life, and even plant life to an extent, can put carbon back in the atmosphere. And if those two processes are roughly equal, the amount of carbon that's in the air remains the same. Think of it like a bank account where you're spending about, I don't know, maybe $500 a month out of that account, but you're putting about 500 back in, and you're keeping a small balance in there. So maybe there's $1,000 in the account, 500 goes in, 500 comes out, but that other 1,000 kind of stays in there like savings. The atmosphere has generally had about the same amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Some goes in, some comes out, stays about the same. And then humans come along. All of this other carbon that's accumulated on Earth in fossil fuels, we started to extract that and we said, hey, there's lots of potential energy in here. And we've burned it for close to 200 years now. And what we're starting to see is the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is going up. That's coming from carbon dioxide from things that we burned. Other sources like methane, so things that decompose, cattle that give off methane. The CH4, another source of carbon, is going in the atmosphere. These are your two big ones, CO2 and methane. CO2 from respiration, CH4 from agriculture and any kind of uh, decomposition processes. Those are getting up in the atmosphere, and it's those that are alleged to be perhaps be causing climate change. I'm not going to get into the politics on that one. I'll just give you definitions. I'll let you do your own research on that. But the general idea is we're putting more carbon into the atmosphere than it's getting pulled out, which is causing a change in the account balance. Imagine I'm putting $700 into an account every month and I'm pulling about 500 out. 700 in, 500 out, that account's going to grow. Now, I'd love for my bank account to grow, but I may not want the amount of carbon in the atmosphere to continue to grow, because if it causes the issues that we think are issues, that's something to think about. Here's ways that carbon can come out of the atmosphere, and here's one way actually it can be an issue. Carbon can leave the atmosphere by dissolving in water. You might be familiar with carbonated beverages, like a Coca-Cola, all the fizz that's in there, or Sprite, or wherever it is you like. That carbon in that liquid, in the water, actually lowers the pH. It makes it more acidic. Remember how on the last slide I was telling you that 70% of the photosynthesis on Earth happens in the oceans? Well, what happens is if the ocean's temperature and pH change, the ability of photosynthesis to happen in the oceans is also going to change. Keep that in mind. Our consumers and our producers. Remember, our consumers are the ones that are actually going to need sugars. They're going to eat stuff. They're going to do cell respiration. They are going to release carbon. Producers are going to fix carbon. They're going to capture carbon. The consumers eat the producers continue to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The main thing I'd like you to be able to do, looking at this diagram here, is see what are the sources of carbon. Where can carbon be stored? Sometimes we call this a carbon sink. Not as in like kitchen sink, but just a place or a reservoir where things can be held. So the Earth is pretty good at storing carbon. We've got some down in the dirt. We've got carbon that gets stuck there because of decomposition. So think a bunch of leaves fall in the forest. Eventually they break down, bacteria, fungi, anything else that's growing there starts to break down those leaves, and that carbon that was in those leaves gets moved into the soil. Soil organisms can release that. There can be a release of gases that gets in the atmosphere, but then the processes like photosynthesis can pull it out. So our big idea here, two things. Carbon fixation, that's any process that can convert atmospheric carbon from gaseous sources like methane and carbon dioxide to solid forms like sugars and biomass. The more photosynthesis happens, the more carbon gets pulled out of the air, and the more biomass there is. So think tree matter, leaf matter, anything that grew that was a plant that actually captured carbon and created biomass, that's carbon fixation. Climate change is the idea that perhaps there are long-term shifts in global temperature and weather patterns. Is average temperature going up? Are weather patterns becoming more extreme? Arguably so, but the thought is that if carbon is entering the atmosphere at greater rates and it's helping the atmosphere retain more heat, then we have a potential for climate change. Did humans cause that? Are there other long-term factors? Perhaps so, but again, I'm not here to get into all that. Main idea is carbon fixation is how photosynthesis gets carbon pulled out, and perhaps humans are causing climate change because of putting too much carbon back.